One of the features of human history is subject of mythology. Now, myths are said to be stories about events and people, gods and goddesses and such like, that were created round the old campfire to regale the sheep with stories of the gods, goddesses that supposedly affected our lives and controlled the human race. Now, I think it's possible to me that what we call the mythology were real events. They weren't so much stories manufactured to teach children how to behave or warn people against doing things that other people don't approve of. I think a lot of them were actually recorded history. So it's we who interpret the writings in a mythological sense that were possibly just records of events. One of the stories of the past is the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is the first piece of writing of a story of an individual predating the Iliad and the Odyssey and those kind of fictional stories. Now, I'm presuming that the Greeks' myths were, some of them at least, were mythological and not actual. I don't know. I haven't looked into that. And I haven't looked into Gilgamesh a great deal, but there's a few interesting things about this and the story of the Anunnaki. So before we get into this, I want to show you a picture of the what Gilgamesh is supposed to have looked like. Now, the time he lived was, I've seen various versions of it, but they're all put somewhere between 2 and 3,000 or 2,800 BC. And the stories about his size and shape and everything vary from 7 foot to 14 feet. Who's to say? Well, anyway, thereby hangs a tale. So now let's have a look. I asked AI to show what Gilgamesh looked like on the basis of recorded knowledge, and standing in front of some typical Sumerian buildings. So I'll show you that first. And now I want to show you what his it was said to be the body of Gilgamesh was found in just before the Iraq War. In Iraq, of course, they discovered the tomb, which, if I understand, it was said to be some sort of ascension machine. The tomb, it wasn't just holding a body, but what is interesting is the body appears to be perfectly well preserved. So, of course, according to academia, this would have been impossible. But anyway, let's just have a look. I'll show you what they are said to have found. I've got no proof of that this is real, but have a look. I have here some writings from Wikipedia. I want to read out. The Anunnaki are a group of deities of the ancient Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians. In the earliest Sumerian writings about them, which come from the post-Akkadian period, the Anunnaki are deities in the pantheon, descendants of An, the god of the heavens, and Ki, the goddess of earth, and their primary function was to decree the fates of humanity. The name Anunnaki is derived from An, the Sumerian god of the sky. The name is variously never mind that. The Anunnaki were believed to be the offspring of An and the earth goddess Ki. Samuel Noah Kramer identifies Ki with the Sumerian mother goddess Nin-Her-Sag, stating that they were probably the same figure. The oldest of the Anunnaki was Enlil, the god of air and chief god of the Sumerian pantheon. The Sumerians believed that until Enlil was born, heaven and earth were inseparable. Then Enlil split heaven and earth in two and carried away the earth, while his father An carried away the sky. Now, that's a hard story to get your head around. I've come across certain ideas in the course of doing my work on consciousness that might give a different version of what all this really means. So that's what I want to describe now. Imagine that there was a time when the Earth, as we know it, and the solar system were part of the universe that all the other planets and stars and galaxies belong to. So, returning to my conventional diagram, the Taijitu, the yin-yang diagram that we've all seen at some time or other, or worn, or had on our car stickers or something. Now, this represents a state of balance between shadow and light, where light is the consciousness of oneness, which is also universal love and no end of other things. Now, and below it here we have the shadow is the unconscious state. It's the state of not light. It's not the opposite of light, it's the absence of light. The light as a point or a little sphere in the void represents the quantum digital universe. That's what we're in now. But before we went into this state, we were balanced between these two dimensions or two states. And something happened. And, well, what happened was that Enlil split heaven and earth in two, carried away the earth, while his father An carried away the sky. Sounds familiar? Well, now, I'm not going to say this was a literal story and that these were the right people who did it, but it was somebody did it. And the process led to what we call the fall, and brings in such things as fallen angels. Now, who believes in angels these days? Well, of course, lots of people do, but not. I'm talking about the kind who fell down when the earth was pushed into this lower dimension. Now, what I'm trying to say is that what happened at that time wasn't a mythological distinction. It was an actual physical process. And what happened was we went from being the balance to being the quantum digital universe that we are in now. This is quanta, if you like, units of light in the void, and the light that once we were part of is still out there, but we are cut off from it. Now, what happened with that was we lost all knowledge of who and what we are, we don't know where we came from and we don't know where we're going. Before that time, we would have known all of those things. It wouldn't have been the mystery. Life wouldn't have been a mystery that it is now. And what I think happened was that the Earth, as it was then, was a combined state which encompassed both those dimensions. The I call the quantum digital dimension, the lower dimension, if you like, though low and high in this context is a bit misleading. But the higher version was I call the analog wave universe. And I would suggest that a strong feature of that existence was the energies of the fifth dimension. Now, we're used to being in the third dimension, and which translates into the fourth dimension with time. And the fifth dimension is the energies, vibrations, and I say sounds, but it's vibrations, really. And I'm not going to say what it's vibrations in. What we call sound is simply lateral vibrations through the air, carrying energy, sonic waves. Now, the energies that created the Earth are somewhat different. They're on a totally different nature from the sound that we know it. But the result, people say sound. But so the Earth would have been a very different place then, and the universe that we're in would have been different. Now, when the fall came, those two dimensions were split. And so the stories of the split, like dividing the waters between the two worlds. So a lot of the water, I think, probably went up to the higher dimension. So much went down to the lower dimension. And I think it was the culmination of a long-term process of trying to develop a greater physicality in the world as it was then. And then when we got to this state of the forced separation, we became totally physical. And we lost access to those attributes such as telepathy and subjective mind that we would have had before. We developed language. We know now from the point of view of what it's like on our dimension, because that's all we know. But we've lost contact with what it was on the higher dimension. Now, what I suggest is that Earth that became the higher dimension is what in the mythologies and religions is known as heaven, and the lower dimension, the one we're in, is what was described as the underworld, basically hell. So if you want to know where hell is, you're living in it. So where does that leave us? Well, if we say that the upper world was a bit larger than the lower world, the surface of our world is where we are. The surface of the other world after the split was located a bit higher, so somewhere around the level of the clouds on average. I'm sure it goes up and down a lot like ours does. We can't actually imagine what it's like. But I think one of the telling phrases from the past is as above, so below. So there was a correspondence between the geography of the higher world and the topography of the lower world. It's always assumed that as above, so below is a metaphysical concept, but I think it could be taken literally. There was some correspondence between the important features of the higher world and the lower world. What happened was that before the fall, the beings on that higher dimension had access to 5D powers, which included the ability to create and manipulate matter. So those beings created a virtual reality on the lower dimension that they could inhabit from the higher dimension in various ways. Now, they may have been able to come down here directly, in which case they would have taken on some form that they could relocate down here and transform into a different set of energies that could survive in this environment. But I think also that the other way they could do it was to create avatars. Now, the avatars would have been some form of humanoid beings that they could occupy and use down here to manifest in this environment and can effectively, play a role down here. And they may very well have been able to go up and down by various means. And I think that one of the key things in creating virtual realities is you need some kind of quantum digital infrastructure that is influenced or driven by wave energies from the higher state to manifest as form in the world below. Now, there were some problems, I suspect, with the world below that required the involvement or the introduction of the moon as a stabilizing influencer in terms of the Earth's rotation, but also as something that would generate the energies required to create this virtual reality environment. And I think the old ubiquitous pyramids that were all over the place were part of that process. They were receivers of energies from the higher dimension, from heaven, the upper world, that were used to create and influence things on the lower dimension. So now we're thinking in terms of the gods. I think that they came down, like the Anunnaki, but probably the beings from up there who came here, created these humanoid bodies, and they developed a form that suited their requirements. Eventually, they may have decided humanoid bodies that they were inhabiting could reproduce themselves and become a species in their own right, so that they, while the early ones may have been vehicles for their own incarnation here, that they became autonomous species that reproduced. And the story of Adam and Eve and all these kind of things, and they led to the creation of the human race as we know it, and they became both useful in some respects and also a nuisance in other ways. So if you're going to create an avatar body for yourself on a lower dimensional world, you want to get it as good as you can. So I think that's why the human being is quite advanced in comparison with all the other creatures populating the earth, including the hominids and what have you, the apes and so on. We aren't like any of them. We didn't evolve to be what we are. We were created for a purpose. Then we kind of escaped the zoo and went farther afield and created civilization of our own. Well, civilization's a bit strong, but people from the higher dimension coming down here with knowledge, they came down in groups of 7, so I understand, and they taught us things, agriculture and architecture, all the other things that we hear stories of them coming down here and doing. Eventually, that tended to cease, I think. They didn't have so much direct involvement. They were still available. Now, if the top of the mountains on the earth coincided with the ground level of the upper world, then what happened was the human beings who wanted to talk to the gods had to climb the mountains to get on their level. and then ask for help, and the gods would materialize without having the trouble of having to come down here. They could communicate some way. I don't know. I'm sure there was all sorts of ways that happened. So it's assumed when they say, oh, the Anunnaki came, or all these other gods and people that came here, you've got to remember the term God doesn't mean what we think it means. It was simply an identifier for people who came from that dimension who had more powers than we have. They came down from the sky. They literally came from a world whose location is in the sky from our point of view. Moses goes up the mountain and comes down with his stone tablets. He got them from them. Whoever it was he was dealing with up there wasn't the creator of the universe. It was a being, an entity on that dimension who had some good ideas about how life could be improved if we only did the right thing. And of course, humans, tell them what to do and tell them what not to do. You know what they're like. We know what we're like. We do the opposite. That's how we are. That's how we're made. Now, there's the story of the Tower of Babel. So I think that was Gilgamesh. I'm not sure. But anyway, somebody wanted one of the beings down here who was semi-divine. In other words, he had a mother from up there, a goddess, and a father from down here, a human being. So he was 2/3 divine. In other words, he had attributes of the higher dimensional beings from his one of his parents. And I think he wanted to cause trouble. So creating a tower that you could go to the top of the tower and it would be, the height would be right for him to cross over into that dimension and do whatever it was he wanted to do. And because the gods found out what he was doing, they were a bit upset. And well, the story's the story. We all heard about it. So you see, if you take these stories as literal histories and not as symbolic fiction, then so much of what's happened, especially the gods from the sky, it doesn't mean they say they came down from the sky. It doesn't mean they came from another world on another star. They might have come, some of them might come from a higher dimension. But you've got to remember the human race was pushed into a lower dimension where there were no other, I don't think anyway, inhabited worlds down here. I think we were the pioneers. And what started out as a convenience for some higher dimensional beings ended up being a spiritual experiment that has actually produced results that weren't anticipated by the people involved. Now, that doesn't mean to say it wasn't anticipated by the spiritual forces that control and run the universe, or the spiritual aspect of things. We've found it by us coming down here in physicality, we came into what we call quantum time. The higher dimension was timeless. So people came from there, could live on that higher dimension. They just popped down from wherever they originated and spend their lives for as long as they felt they needed to, and then they would withdraw and they would leave. Elective, could say. They chose when to withdraw and leave whatever form they had. Either they took it with them or they left it behind. But when you come to Earth, here, time is on or off. It's a quantum effect. The thing with quantum effects is, they don't peter out. They stop dead. They start, instantaneously. There's no half measures. So this has created death. So humanity, in a sense, created death by incarnating down here. Along with death, we acquired aging. So we are aged. So if you think about Gilgamesh, he didn't look as though he'd aged very much. he wanted to be immortal, like the ones up there, which is understandable. They put him through various tests to prove that he was worthy of immortality, which he failed. So in the end, he died. Well, there we are. Join the human race, that's what you get. So many of the mythologies can be explained by the sky gods, people from the higher dimension. Now, one of the things is that they don't control us now in a way where we know that they're there and that what they're doing. So I think that they've changed tactics since the time of Gilgamesh. They no longer work by coming down and revealing themselves, performing some miracles and then popping back. They do things by surreptitious means, I suggest. A lot of the bloodlines of the royals probably were from semi-divine sources, but I suspect they're still around. Now, the Earth is said to be ascending again. Now, I don't know what that means. Now, whether that means a rejoining of the lower dimension and the higher dimension into one, I don't know. I'm a bit surprised, be surprised if it was like that, because, well, all sorts of reasons. But the point is, if we're ascending, then in whatever way or whatever form that ascension is, I think if you look back what it meant in the days of Gilgamesh, ascension, that the Egyptian pharaohs, people like that, they weren't ascending to the spirit world, they were ascending to the higher dimension. So that was the process. There was an elevator process of going up and down, and that getting from the ground up to the higher dimension was an ascension, not necessarily a spiritual ascension, but a semi-physical ascension. Now, if we are ascending, we may become part of their dimension again, or I don't know, I have no idea. But if you look at it from their point of view, humanity are the neighbours from hell, because when we set off the atomic tests in the 40s, what happened is that you see all the UFOs and things, they came pretty quick because when we let off the bombs, they didn't just cause trouble here. I suspect they caused trouble on the higher dimension as well. So of course they're coming down here, and they've been coming down for some long time now, trying to stop us from using nuclear weapons. Well, you can understand why, can't you? You can't release that much energy on the quantum digital dimension without actually causing some problems on the higher, the analog wave dimension. And there are a lot of other reasons why humanity is less desirable. If you're semi-divine beings, you don't want people from the earth moving in next door, do you? So I suspect that one of the reasons for the human race now seeking to get rid of us and eradicate humanity from the earth is to prevent us from ending up there when the ascension takes place. But we don't know yet. I mean, I have no idea what any of this, I'm only telling you what I think, the scenarios I can see that are at the back of what's happening. Got no evidence for any of it, but if you look at so many things that have happened with humanity and on the earth over all these years, if you think that this scenario of a higher world and a lower world, then it makes much more sense than to dismiss everything as mythology Anyway, the point is that everything that happens in the lower dimensions is basically a story working through. But at the back of all this is it's all a spiritual exercise being guided from forces that are way beyond any of us here. The higher dimensions go on, they're infinite. Now, what it's, I think, has been found is that by incarnating on the earth, coping with the stress of death, life, and aging, and everything else, and also having no sense of morality unless we have some spiritual essence within us that influences us, we are actually going through so much stress and suffering that we have evolved spiritually beyond any anticipated level of achievement that might have been expected. We've become potentially divine beings ourselves. And that's what's worrying a lot of these other beings, and the ETs that do come from other worlds, because they have to drop down to our dimension when they get into that. So they probably use the higher world as a staging post for coming down here. There is a massive interest in all the other dimensions and the other, a lot of the extraterrestrial worlds, to see how we cope with this. We're going into a situation that's never been achieved or never been faced, before. We are going to be raised up in consciousness, and it's going to reveal the qualities that we have acquired through our incarnations on this planet. We're going to become something amazing. For a lot of species, for a lot of the spiritual entities that exist in all these states, it's a wonderful thing. But there's a few others who've got a vested interest in keeping us here. Well, you've only got to look at the history of it on the Earth since 2020 to see how things have been working through to get rid of us and limit our influence. So I don't know how it's going to work out, but it's an amazing process. And I think amazing things are going to happen. And I'm hoping that this model of consciousness that I've been working with, as far as I can see, would make a huge difference to humanity if it was understood. But I don't know that people watching my videos are much the wiser when they've seen them than they were before. It's such a difficult concept to put over. It's simple in its way, but the application of the idea, though however simple they are, is very complicated in practice. There's no proof. I've got no proof of any of it. But it comes through to my consciousness so strongly, and I can see that it all hangs together. So much fits. And now I've just come up with some ideas about how infinity itself is structured. Potential infinity and actual infinity, and the key role of the Riemann hypothesis, the zeta function, is so strong. It is consciousness. And why is it then that the Riemann hypothesis is regarded as the greatest test in mathematical circles, waiting to be solved? Well, as far as I can see, it's the mathematics behind the creation of this dimension. But anyway, there we are. So that's it, folks. I hope this makes some sense and that you can see the point I'm making with the gods from the sky, that it's not quite as far-fetched as it sounds. Thank you. Put something to add in here about the Sumerian tablets, the records and the early writings. It's a bit doubtful that everything that was done would be based on pure fiction and fantasy. because I hadn't allowed for the idiosyncrasies of human nature. One of the features of being in the quantum digital dimension is the ego. And I don't think one can think of almost anybody in history who had the ego. Gilgamesh, I didn't know much about him, and I just recently heard a version of the epic of Gilgamesh. And what I've realized is it is presented as a fantasy with our hero performing amazing feats as well as suffering from the effects of the gods and various other trials and problems. So it's pretty obvious that one of the first features of human society, still with us today, is the phenomenon of public relations. And I can see, I don't know when these stories were written in relation to Gilgamesh's actual life, but I'm pretty sure that whatever was recorded at the time or remembered to be passed down would have been exaggerations, but not necessarily total fiction. But I think what probably happened is that some real events took place. I mean, for example, we no longer believe that there were gods that came down to earth. Well, I think that's the main thing that's come out of my work on this idea, that they were very real. They did come down from the higher dimension, and that they are not necessarily gone entirely here, because I think what happened with the fall, some of them were down here at the time it happened, and they got stuck here. The thing about the quantum digital dimension is that it's very prone to ego and exaggeration and all the other features of modern life. Truth is a difficult thing to find on this level. It's too easy, and there are too many shortcuts and benefits to be taken in a material sense from lying. And we see it today very much in politics. Right. Now, so what I'm saying is that I think Epic of Gilgamesh and other stories like it, the mythology, were based on some real events that happened and that have been transformed into exciting stories because people like exciting stories. So I don't know whether they had an equivalent in Gilgamesh's time of Trump derangement syndrome, but I can imagine he wouldn't have been entirely popular with the people he ruled over. And I think it is a good time to consider that humanity does not need ruling. It needs organising. And I hope we can get away from this attitude of always having to have a hierarchy, because it isn't necessary. We need to be organised, but it doesn't have to be through hierarchies and highly important people, because there are no highly important people. We're all just consciousness. We are of the one mind. So nobody's one version of the one mind is going to be any better than anybody else's. It might be able to accomplish more, but in the end, it's all the same. We are all the same consciousness.